Hello, friends, and welcome. Come sit down, get comfortable, and let's step together into a warm little world of everyday adventures. These stories are gentle, cozy, and meant to make you feel right at home, like sitting by the fire on a calm evening. So relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin today's tale. The Path Through the Woods. The morning sun spilled its light over the quiet countryside, dusting the meadows in a soft golden glow. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the earthy scent of dew and moss. Along a winding path that cut through the woodland, Edwin the mouse walked with an unhurried step. He carried a small satchel slung across his shoulder, its weight shifting with each movement, filled with papers, pencils, and other small items he thought might be useful that day. Edwin liked to walk this path in the morning before setting about his chores. It was peaceful, shaded by tall oaks whose branches arched overhead like cathedral rafters. Birds sang from hidden nests, and now and again a rabbit darted across the track, vanishing into the undergrowth. Edwin knew nearly every stone and turn of this path, but somehow each walk felt new. At the far end of the woods lived Tom, a kindly mole who had recently been working on a new garden patch near his home. Edwin had promised to bring him a few old papers, sketches and notes about how to arrange borders of flowers so they would bloom in steady succession through the seasons. It wasn't so much that Tom needed advice. He was perfectly capable of gardening. But Tom enjoyed Edwin's thoughtful little diagrams, and Edwin enjoyed making them. The mouse reached the mole's cottage just as Tom was setting out a wooden bench in the sun. "Ah, Edwin," Tom called, brushing soil from his paws. "You've come early. Sit with me a moment before we get to work." Edwin smiled, handing him the satchel. "I thought you might enjoy these. I've drawn some ideas for planting around your path." Together, they unrolled the papers on the bench, Tom's eyes squinting as he followed the lines and notes. "Clever, clever," Tom said, tapping a paw against the sketches. "You've made it look like a story more than a plan. Every flower leading to the next. I'll have to follow it carefully." The two friends talked for a while before Tom fetched a jug of cool water. Soon they moved to the patch of ground near his gate. The earth had already been turned, dark and rich, waiting for seed. The friends spent the late morning setting things in order, marking lines with twine, digging shallow rows, patting soil back over the seeds. The work was steady but never hurried. They paused often to watch the clouds drift by or to listen to a woodpecker hammering in the distance. When noon approached, Tom insisted they sit again on the bench. He sliced bread, spread a bit of honey, and the two ate quietly while the garden patch lay before them, seeds tucked safely into the ground. The satisfaction of the morning's work seemed to hum around them, like the bees that moved lazily between flowers nearby. Edwin, brushing crumbs for his whiskers, leaned back. "This is the sort of morning I like best. Work enough to keep you honest, rest enough to keep you happy." Tom chuckled, "and company enough to keep it all worthwhile." The next day, Edwin returned along the same woodland path. He had not planned to visit Tom again so soon, but there was something he wanted to show him. The evening before, while riding by lamplight, Edwin had come across an old notebook he had forgotten. In it, there were not only sketches but little observations of the woods from seasons past. He thought Tom would enjoy hearing them. The path was quieter than the day before, though Edwin heard the distant chatter of squirrels. As he rounded a bend, he noticed something curious near the roots of a large oak. A patch of mushrooms, pale and delicate, had sprung up overnight. They were arranged in a near-perfect circle. Edwin crouched, whiskers twitching. He did not think much of superstitions, but he couldn't deny it was an odd sight. Still, mushrooms were mushrooms, and he thought Tom might know what kind they were. By the time Edwin reached the mole's cottage, Tom was already at work by the garden patch, watering the soil carefully. "Back again, are you?" Tom said with a grin. I had a feeling I'd see you sooner than later. I found something along the path, Edwin said, setting his satchel on the bench. A circle of mushrooms just at the roots of the oak near the bend. I thought you might know what to make of it. Tom rubbed his chin. Mushrooms do like to appear in circles now and again. Folk call them fairy rings, but it's just the way they grow underground, all in a spreading pattern. Nothing mysterious in it. Still, he added with a chuckle, best not to step into one unless you want to feel a bit dizzy. The two of them laughed, and Edwin shared the notebook pages, reading aloud small passages he had written years before. Notes about a fox seen crossing the field, or how the first frost had looked on the meadow grass. Tom listened with deep interest, as though each detail was something precious. Later, when Edwin returned home, he thought about the mushrooms. He decided he might sketch them the next morning, not out of superstition, but simply because they had caught his attention. Sometimes the smallest things deserve a place in memory. Several days passed before Edwin and Tom met again, but this time it was not at the garden. Instead, they planned to walk together along the riverbank in the evening, when the day's heat had softened and the light grew gentle. Edwin arrived with a walking stick and found Tom waiting by the path. They set off together, moving at an easy pace, talking about little things, how the weather had been kind to the garden, how Tom had seen a hedgehog near his door one night, how Edwin had been sketching trees by the stream. The river lay broad and calm, its surface reflecting the fading sky. They walked until they reached a bend where a willow leaned low, trailing its branches in the water. There they stopped, watching swallows dip and rise. "It feels good to end the day this way," Tom said, lowering himself onto a smooth stone. Nothing hurried, nothing loud, just the river and the company. Edwin nodded, resting beside him. "Sometimes I think this is what life should be. Simple and steady. No more, no less." They sat a long while in silence, the only sound the rustle of the willow and the murmur of the current. When they finally rose to return home, the first stars were beginning to appear. The two friends walked side by side, content in the quiet bond of shared time. It was not an extraordinary evening by most measures, but for Edwin and Tom, it was exactly what they wanted, a piece of ordinary life that felt full, like a story worth keeping. The evening was just settling in when Edwin sat by his window with a small oil lamp glowing softly on the sill. His quill scratched steadily across the page as he added lines to his sketches, shaping the outlines of the mushrooms he had seen earlier in the woods. He paused now and then, staring out the window toward the fading light over the meadow. A faint knock came at his door, light but deliberate. Edwin tilted his head, set the quill down, and padded across the room to answer. When he opened the door, he found a hedgehog standing shyly on the threshold, his spines tipped with bits of grass and leaves from his walk. "Good evening," the hedgehog said politely, bowing his head slightly. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Edwin replied warmly. Come in. I was only in my sketches." The hedgehog stepped inside, carefully brushing his spines against the doorframe so as not to knock anything over. "My name is Barnaby," he said once he was settled. "I recently moved into a burrow not far from the riverbank. Tom told me I might find a friend in you." Edwin's ears perked. Tom knows what he's about." "You're most welcome, Barnaby. Please sit. I've just set the kettle to boil. Shall we have some tea?" They settled at Edwin's small wooden table, and soon enough the kettle whistled. Edwin poured the tea into two mismatched mugs, the steam curling gently upward. Barnaby wrapped his small paws around the cup, clearly pleased. "It's a fine place you have here," Barnaby said, glancing around at the neat shelves of books and the carefully stacked sketches. "It feels well cozy, comfortable." Edwin smiled. "It's nothing grand, but it suits me. I like to keep things simple." The hedgehog nodded thoughtfully. I was hoping to ask if you and Tom might join me tomorrow evening. I have a mind to make a little supper outside my burrow, and I'd be glad for the company. Nothing fancy, just roasted roots and perhaps a loaf of bread. It seems a shame to eat alone when one has just moved to a new place. Of course, Edwin said at once. I'll gladly come, and I know Tom will too. He'll be eager to see you again. The next evening found the three of them gathered by Barnaby's burrow near the riverbank. He had made a small fire of twigs, which crackled cheerfully while a clay pot rested atop, filled with fragrant roots roasting in a bit of oil. The smell was earthy and sweet, and the night air carried the sound of crickets chirping. Barnaby proved to be an excellent storyteller, weaving gentle tales of his wanderings before he settled here. He spoke of quiet valleys with tall grasses, of hills where wild thyme grew, of nights spent listening to owls calling from the trees. Edwin and Tom listened intently, and when Barnaby paused, Tom added his own simple account of the woodland paths, the garden patch, and his small adventures along the river. As they ate together, Edwin thought how fine it was to have another friend in their little circle. He watched the glow of the firelight on Barnaby's spines, on Tom's thoughtful face, and felt that life, simple as it was, seemed richer each time a new connection was made. When the meal was done and the fire burned low, they sat in a contented hush, gazing at the stars that now glimmered above. It was the beginning of another bond, steady and unassuming, like the turning of the seasons themselves. The next morning broke with heavy gray clouds rolling low over the treetops. The air was thick with the promise of rain. Edwin rose early and looked out, tugging his little shawl around his shoulders. He had intended to sketch by the riverbank, but he knew the weather would not allow it. By mid-morning, the first drops fell, light at first, then steadily heavier, until the entire woodland was wrapped in the sound of rainfall. The paths glistened with puddles, the river swelled, and the grass bent low under the weight of water. Edwin, however, did not mind the rain. He found it soothing, and the sound against his thatched roof was like a lullaby. He decided to make the best of it by inviting Tom and Barnaby to his cottage for the afternoon. He lit the fire in his hearth, set out 3 sturdy chairs, and busied himself with gathering some old stories he had written years ago. Sure enough, Tom arrived just after midday, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Thought we'd best have something to nibble," he said, setting it down, a loaf of bread, still warm. Barnaby followed soon after, his spines dripping with rain, but his eyes cheerful. "What a storm. The burrow is dry, but I nearly sank into the mud getting here." They all laughed, and Edwin gave them each a towel to dry themselves before settling in by the fire. The rain beat steadily outside, making the cottage feel all the more snug. The afternoon passed in the best of ways. They shared bread and butter, listened as Edwin read aloud from his old stories, and paused often to talk about small things. How the mushrooms along the oak were faring, how Tom's garden was sprouting, how Barnaby had found a smooth pebble shaped like an egg near the riverbank. The rhythm of the rain seemed to carry their conversation along, unhurried and calm. Tom dozed a little in his chair, while Barnaby studied Edwin's sketches with keen interest. "You've a gift for catching small details," he remarked. "It makes the ordinary seem important." Edwin smiled, touched by the comment. "Perhaps it is important," he said softly. "After all, it's the ordinary that fills most of our days." By evening, the rain softened and the air grew misty. Tom and Barnaby prepared to leave, but not before promising that the next gathering would be at Tom's cottage, where he planned to try his paw at baking something new. Edwin watched them go, the damp air cool against his fur, and thought how pleasant the day had been. Rainy days, he realized, held their own kind of treasure, quiet, slow, and deeply comforting. When Tom said he would try baking, Edwin and Barnaby did not know quite what to expect. Tom was a fine gardener and steady worker, but he had never been known for his skill in the kitchen. Still, the following afternoon, they both set off along the woodland path toward Tom's cottage, curious to see what awaited them. As they arrived, they could already smell something rich and sweet drifting through the air. Tom met them at the door, apron tied around his stout frame, flour dusting his paws and snout. Come in," he said with unusual excitement. The table was laid with simple dishes, but the center rested a round loaf, golden on top, with the faintest crackle where it had baked through. "It's not much," Tom said with a hint of pride, "but I followed a recipe as best I could." Edwin and Barnaby eagerly sat while Tom sliced the loaf. The bread was dense but warm, with a nutty flavor that surprised them both. "Why, Tom, this is marvelous," Barnaby declared after his first bite. "I dare say you found yourself a new talent." Tom chuckled modestly. "Well, perhaps with a bit of practice, but I'll admit it was rather enjoyable." The rest of the afternoon was spent in cheerful trial and error. Tom attempted another batch while Edwin read the instructions aloud and Barnaby tried mixing the dough. There were a few spills, plenty of flour on the floor, and much laughter, especially when Barnaby accidentally knocked the bowl with his spines and sent flour puffing into the air like smoke. By the time the sun began to dip, they had produced 2 more loaves, one lopsided, the other quite respectable. They agreed that baking together might become a new habit, something to turn to when the days grew shorter and colder. As Edwin walked home that evening, the memory of their laughter lingered with him. He thought about how ordinary tasks, gardening, sketching, baking, seemed to take on new life when shared. And he felt grateful, once again, for the simple companionship of his friends. Edwin sat at his table one breezy morning, a roll of parchment unfurled before him. His quill scratched thoughtfully as he drew neat lines across the page. A faint smile tugged at his whiskers. It was not a letter he was writing, nor even a story. It was a map of the meadow where he and Tom often walked, dotted with little notes about where flowers grew, where certain mushrooms liked to appear, and where one could reliably find blackberries in late summer. The idea had come to him the evening before, when Barnaby had asked how far the meadow stretched and whether it reached the hills beyond the willow grove. "I've walked it many times," Edwin had replied, "but I've never measured it. Still, I know it well enough that I could draw it for you." And so here he was, quill scratching away, labeling spots with careful letters. When he had finished, he rolled the parchment gently, tied it with string, and tucked it into his satchel. He would take it with him to Tom's cottage later that morning. The path through the woods was alive with birdsong as Edwin set out. A woodpecker hammered industriously on a distant trunk, while a robin darted from bush to bush ahead of him. By the time he reached Tom's garden, the mole was already bent over the neat rows of sprouting shoots, humming a low tune. "Morning, Tom," Edwin called cheerfully. Tom straightened, brushing soil from his paws. "Ah, Edwin, what brings you out so early? You've the look of someone with a secret." Edwin laughed. "Not a secret, something to share. Let's wait for Barnaby, though. He'll want to see this too." Sure enough, Barnaby soon appeared, carrying a small basket. "I thought we might need a nibble if we're going to be busy," he said, lifting the cloth to reveal early apples. When they were gathered around Tom's bench, Edwin unrolled the map. Both friends leaned in, eyes widening. The meadow was drawn in careful lines, dotted with tiny sketches of flowers and trees, labeled neatly in Edwin's hand. "Why, this is marvelous," Barnaby exclaimed. "You've captured it perfectly. The little clump of daisies by the willow, the slope of the hill, it's all here." Tom traced a paw over the parchment. "And here's where the mushrooms were." "Yes? And my garden patch just beyond?" "Splendid. It's like seeing our world in a new way." The three of them decided then, and they're to take the map with them on a walk through the meadow to see if Edwin had missed anything. They set off with light steps, pausing often to compare the drawing with the land around them. They added notes in the margins as they went: elderberry bush near the stream, badger's burrow under the hill, patch of forget-me-nots. By the time they returned, the map was smudged and marked with fresh ink, more lively than it had been that morning. "We'll have to keep this safe," Tom said with satisfaction. "It'll be useful not just for us, but for anyone who wanders these paths in the years to come." And Edwin, though his paw ached from all the writing, felt a warm glow of pride. For in that map was not just the meadow, but the memory of their morning together, carefully recorded and kept. Barnaby had not been long in his new burrow, but already it had the feeling of a home. The hedgehog had worked steadily to make it snug, lining the floors with woven mats of rushes, stacking shelves with jars of dried herbs, and setting a small wooden table near the hearth. But there was still something missing: the warmth of friends filling the space with laughter and talk. So one afternoon, Barnaby announced that he would hold a little burrow warming, nothing grand, just a gathering to make his new home feel truly lived in. He delivered the invitations himself, neatly written slips of paper left at Tom's gate, slipped under Edwin's door, and even tucked into the hollow where the squirrel twins lived. When the day came, the burrow was glowing with lamplight, and the soft scent of dried lavender hung in the air. Barnaby had set the table with care, not laden with food, for he had little skill in cooking yet, but adorned with wildflowers in a small jug and a bowl of nuts and apples. Edwin arrived first, carrying a bundle of papers. "For your shelves," he explained, "some old sketches and notes. Every home needs a bit of clutter." Tom followed with a sturdy wooden stool he had carved himself. "A proper seat for guests," he said gruffly but kindly. One by one, the others trickled in: Marin the field mouse with a jar of blackberry jam, the squirrel twins with a string of acorns polished smooth, and even little Larkspur the vole, who brought a pouch of dried mint leaves. The burrow filled with voices and cheer. Barnaby beamed as he watched everyone settle, his once quiet home now bustling with warmth. They played small games, guessing who could tell the longest story without pausing, or who could balance a nut on their nose the longest, a game in which the squirrels naturally excelled. When the evening grew later, they all crowded near the hearth while Barnaby shared tales of his travels, his spines catching the firelight. The others listened raptly, adding their own memories until the room seemed to hum with shared life. By the time the last guest departed, Barnaby stood alone in the burrow, his heart full. The shelves held gifts, the rush mats bore the prints of many paws, and the air still carried the sound of. Some days later, Tom and Edwin found themselves deep in discussion as they walked together along the woodland path. Tom, with his paws clasped behind his back, frowned thoughtfully. "Do you suppose, Edwin, that it's better to always follow the same path, or strike off now and then into new ones?" Edwin tilted his head. "What do you mean exactly?" "Well," Tom said, "I walk the same track to the river each day, the same one to your cottage, and the same one to Barnaby's. It's steady, reliable, but I wonder if I might be missing something by not trying another way." Edwin chuckled softly. "Ah, the old question, comfort in the familiar or surprise in the unknown. I suppose there's value in both." That afternoon, they decided to test the matter. Instead of the usual path, they struck off toward a narrower trail that wound between hazel bushes. The ground was uneven, roots snaking across it, and brambles tugged at their fur. But the air felt fresher, filled with scents they did not notice on their ordinary walks. To their surprise, the trail opened into a clearing they had never visited before. At its center grew a lone birch tree, its pale bark gleaming, with a hollow at its base. Inside the hollow, neatly arranged, were feathers, moss, and bits of bark, clearly the work of some careful creature making a home. "Well now," Tom said, his eyes wide. "Imagine missing this all these years just by taking the same path." Edwin nodded. "And yet, we might have missed the comfort of our old way had we not walked it so often. Both have their place, I think." They lingered in the clearing, listening to the wind sigh through the birch leaves. Then, with satisfied hearts, they returned by their familiar path, feeling it a little different now that they had tried another. That evening, Edwin added a new note to his meadow map: "Hidden clearing with birch, worth visiting again." Spring was always a hopeful season in the woodland, but this year Tom found himself unusually anxious about his garden. The mole had planted neat rows of beans, carrots, and lettuces, and though the shoots had emerged, some looked paler than he expected, their leaves curling as though unhappy. Tom stood in the morning light one day, paws on his hips, frowning down at them. Edwin came by with his satchel of papers and sketches, intending only to share a few thoughts about the meadow map. He found Tom muttering quietly to himself, poking the soil with a stick. "What seems to be the trouble, old friend?" Edwin asked. "Trouble?" Tom huffed. "It's this patch of beans. They're sulking. Won't grow straight, won't thicken. I've tried watering, I've tried shading them. Perhaps the soil's no good here." Edwin knelt beside him, brushing his paw through the dirt. "It feels damp enough. Have you thought of speaking to Barnaby? Hedgehogs know a good deal about soil and insects." Reluctant as Tom was to admit defeat, he agreed. That afternoon, Barnaby padded over, carrying a small bag of herbs. He crouched low, sniffed the soil, examined the leaves, and finally nodded. "Aphids," he announced. "Tiny things. You can barely see them unless you look close. They drink the sap from the shoots. I've some mint and tansy here. If we sprinkle them between the rows, it'll keep the little thieves away." Tom followed the advice, and within a week the beans were standing straighter, their leaves a richer green. Relief washed over him, though he was still muttering about how he ought to have noticed sooner. "No shame in needing a second pair of eyes," Barnaby said kindly. "That's what neighbors are for." Edwin, who had been quietly sketching the progress, added a new illustration to his collection: Tom's beans, rescued by mint. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it marked another thread in the web of friendship that bound them together. When the beans finally reached their first harvest, Tom invited both friends to share in the meal. He cooked them simply, boiled with butter and a sprinkle of salt, and though he grumbled about how little there was, Edwin declared it the finest meal of the season. And Tom, though he never quite said it aloud, felt a swelling pride in the quiet success. His garden had endured, with a little help, and in its growth he saw something of his own place among friends, steady, rooted, and enduring. Edwin had long been known as the one with parchment and quill, the mouse who could turn any corner of woodland life into neat sketches or flowing words. But one late summer afternoon, while Tom tended his garden and Barnaby organized his herbs, Edwin found himself restless. Writing and drawing were good, but he wanted something more tangible this time, something to hold, to shape with his paws. He had been saving small scraps of wood, gathered from the edges of the Carpenter Jay's workshop. Carefully, Edwin carried them back to his cottage, laying them out across his desk. "A box," he murmured to himself. "Just a little box to keep letters or feathers, something useful." It was slow work. His paws were better suited to ink than to carving knives, and more than once he nicked his whiskers or shaved too much from a corner. But he persisted, humming softly as he shaped the pieces. When Tom stopped by and saw the scattered wood, he raised a brow. "What's all this, Edwin? Have you abandoned your quills for carpentry?" "Not abandoned," Edwin replied with a grin. "But I thought I might try. Words can hold memory, but so can objects. Imagine keeping our meadow map, when it's finished, in a box made by my own paws." Tom, half skeptical and half admiring, helped sand the edges smooth. Barnaby, when he heard of it, brought a small pot of beeswax polish. To keep the wood from drying, he explained. Weeks passed before Edwin's box was ready. It was a little crooked, its lid not quite even, but to him it shone like treasure. He placed within it the very first meadow sketch, the one they had smudged with notes on their long walk. And when his friends saw it, their approval warmed him more than any polished praise. "You've given it life," Barnaby said. "That box will hold our stories for years to come." And indeed, as the days went by, Edwin slipped other things inside. Tiny pressed flowers from a meadow, a feather from the robin who always perched near his window, and a note in Tom's steady hand reminding him when to come for supper. The box was imperfect, yes, but it became a vessel of memory, heavy with the quiet weight of shared days. Autumn arrived gently, cloaking the meadow in gold and russet. Barnaby, whose burrow had grown comfortable and well-stocked, felt a sudden urge to stretch his legs farther than usual. So one crisp morning, with dew still clinging to the grass, he set out on a longer walk than he'd yet taken since settling in. He followed the stream that wound beyond Tom's garden, its banks crowded with rushes and late-blooming wildflowers. The air smelled faintly of apples, carried from an orchard farther uphill, and the hedgehog felt the steady rhythm of his paws soothing his thoughts. At a bend in the stream, he discovered something unexpected, a flat stone, wide and smooth like a natural seat. Someone had left a little pile of acorns upon it, carefully arranged. Curious, Barnaby sat down and rested there, listening to the trickle of water. He could imagine many creatures using the spot. Birds for a quick drink, squirrels for a pause in their foraging. As he sat, a gentle sense of belonging came over him. For months he had worried whether he truly fit into this woodland, whether he was just a visitor. But here, on the stone, with the water singing beside him, he felt woven into the land. He plucked one acorn from the pile, rolled it between his paws, then set it back, adding a sprig of mint from his pouch beside it, as though answering the quiet gesture of whoever had left the acorns first. When he returned later and told Tom and Edwin about the stone, they insisted on visiting it together. The three of them walked out the following morning, finding the place just as Barnaby had described. Tom tested the seat with a grunt of approval, while Edwin made a quick sketch of the scene. "We'll call it the Resting Stone," Edwin declared, adding it to his map. They lingered there, sharing apples and stories, and when they rose to leave, they left another offering. 3 small tokens side by side, a feather, a bean seed, and a polished pebble. No one knew who would find them next, but it felt right to add their own mark to the quiet circle of the woodland. Autumn evenings came earlier now, draping the woodland in long shadows and chill breezes. Tom, who disliked stumbling about in the dark, decided he needed more than a single stub of candle to light his burrow. His tunnels were winding, with shelves and little alcoves, and the thought of tripping over his own boots one night filled him with dread. "I'll make a lantern," he declared one morning, though to whom he said it remained uncertain, for only the crows heard him as they flapped overhead. Still, he set to work. He collected a stout glass jar left long ago at the woodland's edge, cleaned it carefully until it gleamed, and fashioned a little wire handle with some help from the jay, who was handy with scraps of metal. At first Tom thought the task done, but when he lit a candle inside, the flames smoked and sputtered. "No good," he muttered. "It needs air." That was when Edwin came by, notebook in paw. He studied the jar with his usual quiet attention. "A lid with holes," he suggested, "like a starry sky. Then the light can breathe." The idea suited Tom. He hammered small holes in the lid, uneven though they were, and when he lit the candle again, Beams of light streamed out in tiny rays. Barnaby joined them that evening, bringing chestnuts roasted in his hearth. The three sat outside Tom's burrow as the lantern cast star-shaped flecks upon the earth. "Looks like the night sky, brought underground," Barnaby said warmly. Pleased, Tom carried the lantern inside when the evening grew cold. It made his burrow seem friendlier, almost cheerful, as though the stars themselves had chosen to visit. He grumbled something about a silly ornament, but his eyes lingered on the dancing light with unmistakable fondness. From then on, the lantern became a fixture. On stormy nights, it glowed steadily at the entrance, a beacon for friends who stopped by. And each time Edwin sketched the lantern's glow, or Barnaby spoke of its warmth, Tom felt a private swell of pride, though he never admitted as much. Edwin was not usually one to wander without purpose, but one late afternoon, he noticed a curious trail of feathers scattered along the woodland path. They were not the bright plumage of jays or magpies, but soft, pale gray ones, small enough to belong to a dove. Intrigued, Edwin tucked his notebook beneath his arm and followed. The feathers led past the old oak roots, across a narrow stream where stepping stones gleamed with moss, and finally up a low rise overlooking the meadow. There, nestled among the grass, he discovered the source, a nest, tumbled partly from a branch above. The nest still held 2 intact eggs, unbroken despite the fall. Edwin's heart thumped with concern. He had no skill in climbing, and though he longed to restore the nest to its rightful place, his paws trembled at the thought of balancing on that high bough. Fortunately, Tom and Barnaby were not far off. Hearing Edwin's call, they hurried over. Tom fetched a ladder he kept near his garden shed, while Barnaby steadied it with careful paws. Slowly, grumbling the whole way about foolishness, Tom climbed the rungs and set the nest back into the crook of the tree. When it was done, the 3 friends stood quietly below, watching the dove return. She fluttered down, checked her eggs, and settled herself with a soft coo of relief. "It may be a small thing," Edwin said at last, voice hushed, "but we've saved a home." The word stayed with him long after. That evening, he sketched the nest not as a tumble, but as a circle of safety, with the 3 of them standing below. Later, when he looked at the drawing, he saw more than a simple rescue. He saw the measure of their companionship. Each had a part to play. Barnaby with steadiness, Tom with grit, himself with notice. The trail of feathers had ended, but the memory would remain like a soft gray mark upon his heart. As autumn deepened, Barnaby wandered one morning toward the orchard beyond the meadow. The air was sharp with the tang of fallen fruit, and the grass glittered with dew. The hedgehog adored apples, though he never gathered more than his paws could carry. On this day, however, he noticed something odd. Many apples lay scattered in piles, not haphazardly as the wind might toss them, but gathered neatly as though by design. Curious, Barnaby followed the little clusters until he found the culprit, a family of squirrels, busily arranging apples into careful mounds. "Morning to you," Barnaby called politely. The eldest squirrel, brushing his paws, looked up with a grin. "Morning. We're storing them for cider pressing later. Won't do to have them rolling every which way." Barnaby nodded in admiration. "Neat work. I thought perhaps the trees themselves had grown tidy." The squirrels laughed and offered him one of the smaller apples. Barnaby accepted, biting into its crisp sweetness. Juice dribbled down his whiskers, and he chuckled at himself. "Nothing better than an apple on a cool morning," he declared. He lingered, helping to roll a few more into piles, though his paws were slower than the squirrel's nimble claws. In return, they gave him a small basketful to take home. He carried it back proudly, sharing one apple with Tom and another with Edwin that evening. "This one tastes of sunlight," Tom said after a thoughtful bite. "And this one," Edwin added, "of crisp leaves underfoot." Barnaby only smiled, pleased that the orchard's gift could be spread among them. Later, he placed the last apple upon the resting stone beside the stream, as a quiet offering to whoever might pass. He thought of the unseen neighbor who had once left acorns there, and he wondered if perhaps their small exchanges formed a kind of conversation, wordless but full of meaning. The chill of late October crept steadily into the woodland. Leaves, once bright with crimson and gold, now fell dry and brittle, rustling underpaw whenever Tom crossed from his garden to his burrow. He had been working steadily these last weeks to put his home in order. Carrots packed in a straw, beans dried and jarred, potatoes stored in a cool nook where the soil kept damp. Yet no matter how carefully he arranged things, Tom felt a nagging unease. Not enough, he muttered to himself one morning, surveying his shelves with paws folded. Never enough. One frost too harsh, and I'll be down to gnawing bark. Edwin, who had stopped in to borrow a quill, found Tom in this mood. He stood quietly for a moment, watching his friend pace between shelves. "It looks full to me," Edwin offered gently. "You've enough to last until spring's first crocuses." But Tom would not be soothed so easily. You never can tell with winters. Remember the year the frost lasted past Candlemas? My stores went bare by February. I won't have it again. Barnaby, arriving soon after with a pouch of dried mint for Tom's pantry, listened to this and chuckled. "You're too hard on yourself, friend. The earth gives enough if you share and trade. And besides, no one here lets neighbors go hungry." That evening, they all sat together at Tom's table. The mole had reluctantly allowed them to fetch jars from his shelves. Beans cooked with thyme, carrots stewed soft, and roasted chestnut for Barnaby's hearth. Edwin contributed slices of dark bread he had baked himself, while Barnaby brewed a pot of tea rich with herbs. "Look at this table," Edwin said when the plates were full. "Each of us brought something, and together it's more than enough. That's the true storage." Tom huffed, though his eyes softened. "Perhaps, but I'll feel easier with another sack of potatoes tucked away." Still, when his lantern was lit that night and the shelves glowed golden under its rays, Tom allowed himself a moment of pride. He had dug, planted, tended, harvested, and now his burrow brimmed with the fruit of his labor. And though he grumbled about scarcity, he knew deep down that his friend's presence filled a space no sack of potatoes ever could. While Tom fretted about storage and Barnaby busied himself with herbs, Edwin had turned to a quieter project. His little cottage, snug against a willow's roots, had a small window looking out toward the meadow. Often he wrote there, but the sill was narrow and the chair uncomfortable. One evening, rubbing his sore back after a long bout of sketching, Edwin thought, why not build a proper seat? He measured the nook carefully, using bits of string, and set about collecting wood from the jay's leftover scraps again. The jay, amused at the mouse's persistence in carpentry, lent him a few straight boards and a pouch of nails. It was not easy work. Edwin's paws blistered, and more than once his hammering echoed too loudly in the still night. Yet gradually a seat took shape, broad enough for him to sit with his notebook spread across his knees. Lined with a cushion, he stitched himself from old fabric. When at last he finished, he invited Tom and Barnaby to inspect it. Tom tapped the wood with a critical claw, muttering, "Sturdy enough, though a touch uneven." Barnaby, always kinder, declared it a throne fit for a poet. Edwin laughed, settling himself upon the seat. From there he could see the meadow's slope, the distant glimmer of the stream, and the sky where clouds drifted slow. The first frost sparkled faintly that morning, and his paws itched to record the sight. He filled pages that week, sketches of robins hopping near the hedge, verses about mist rising from the stream, Notes on the hush that fell when twilight painted the world silver. The seat became more than a place to sit. It was a frame through which he viewed the woodland, a gentle reminder that beauty could be found even in stillness. One evening, as the three friends gathered, Edwin pointed out the view. See how the last leaves cling to the birch. They shine like little coins. Without this seat, I might have missed them. Tom grunted, but secretly admired the thought, while Barnaby hummed in agreement. Thus the window seat became a symbol of autumn's gift. Not just harvest, but quiet moments of seeing, of pausing, of letting the heart rest upon the world. The first true frost came, with little warning. Barnaby woke to find his windows traced with delicate ice, each pane glittering with fern-like patterns. Outside, the grass crunched beneath his paws, and the stream steamed faintly in the morning chill. Barnaby loved such mornings. Wrapping a scarf about his neck, he set out for a walk, eager to feel the crisp air fill his lungs. Along the way, he gathered small sprigs of rosemary and thyme, still clinging to life in sheltered corners, their scents sharp against the frost. As he neared Tom's burrow, he saw his friend outside, shovel in paw, trying to clear a path free of slippery leaves. Blasted frost, Tom grumbled. Slippery as eel skin, this is. Barnaby only laughed, helping to sweep the path with his paws. Frost is a friend, too. It clears the air and sweetens the soil. Edwin joined them soon after, clutching his notebook close to his chest to shield it from the chill. He looked rather small in his oversized scarf, whiskers twitching with every puff of frosty breath. I thought I might write by the stream, he said, though he shivered. Best not freeze your tail off, Tom muttered, but he fetched a spare blanket for him all the same. Together, the three spent that morning by the water. Tom checked the earth where he planned to dig more storage. Barnaby collected frozen sprigs, and Edwin wrote, his paws moving quickly to capture the sharp clarity of the day. At last, when their breath came in clouds and their ears ached with cold, they returned indoors. Barnaby brewed a strong tea, rich with herbs, while Tom toasted bread over his fire. Edwin read aloud a few lines from his morning's work. Verses about frost painting windows, about streams breathing steam, about friends walking together in the crisp light. The words filled the burrow as warmly as the fire itself. Tom, though he rolled his eyes, felt the truth of them settle deep in his chest. Barnaby smiled into his cup, content that such simple mornings could weave threads as strong as any grand adventure. The frost had come, yes, but so had the comfort of companionship, and that was enough to make even the coldest day feel warm. The end. Thank you so much for joining me in this chapter of Willow Lane. I hope the quiet moments, the snow-dusted paths, and the warmth of the hearth brought a little peace to your day. If you enjoyed this cozy tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use a bit of calm and comfort. Until next time, may your evenings be warm, your days be gentle, and your heart always find the quiet joys in life.